Good afternoon, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and welcome to the final session of the stand sessions here at the Manchester stand. I haven't been able to get to every single one myself, but I think that what we've had in the most interesting, thought-provoking sessions for quite a few years, from what I've heard from people who've been along to them, and there is a strand that has been running throughout them, which is that the new currency of the 21st century is actually ideas. It's the ideas that come through virtual reality, through graphene, and through all the things that Manchester do and has done as a city. But ideas only come through people. And so what our cities have to become, whereas previously they were perhaps there for goods, the manufacturing of goods, or for providing finance and services, which was arguably where the 19th century was and the 20th century was, cities have to become the backdrops for people to come and share ideas. And of course, people have lifestyle choices. They can decide which city they want to go to. They can decide not even to come into a city, as we discovered yesterday with virtual reality. So cities have got to act as the places where people will come to share ideas. And that's really the challenge for all of our cities. And we're all facing them, and we're all doing it slightly differently. Taking that on to make that lifestyle sustainable is then the next big issue for us all. How do you go about increasing living standards within environmentally acceptable levels? How do we make sure that the energy that we use to deliver the places that we live in, the places to share ideas, are actually not in many ways decreasing our long-term livability? And that is what Mark Watts is going to be talking about this evening. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Mark from Arup to talk through some of his ideas on making cities resilient and sustainable. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. I'm Mark Watts from Arup. I lead Arup's work with cities on the issue of sustainability and responding to climate change in particular around the world. What I wanted to do today was really to focus on what I see as being the sort of single biggest challenge for cities pretty much everywhere in the world, which is how they can simultaneously increase standards of living whilst constraining resource consumption within what we now understand to be the world's ecological limits. And that's a gargantuan task for many reasons, of which, and I promise there won't be many graphs in this presentation, but I think one needs it at the start. I've picked out just two things here, which is first in the graph on the right, which is showing that we already understand that the rate at which we are consuming the natural resources upon which human civilization relies has now increased past the point, the sort of biocapacity of the world, past the point at which the Earth has the ability to regenerate those resources for future generations to rely on. Climate change and its impacts on global warming is the one we talk about most, but there are lots of other global Earth limits that we're pushing up against now, whether it's the destruction of fisheries, the erosion of soil productivity, or indeed climate change. So on the one hand, the starting point is we're already exceeding global ecological limits. But then if one looks at the graph on the left, of course, we know that population is continuing to explode from 2 billion people at the middle of the 20th century to 6 billion now, and a projection up to 9 billion in the next few decades. So how on earth do we carry on improving the quality of life for the existing population, that rising population, bearing in mind that 1 billion people still live in absolute poverty in the world, whilst living within that ecological capacity that the Earth has to provide for us? Now, I'm going to take an optimistic viewed today and focus on the positives, the examples from around the world, from Arup's work with cities around the world, of how that is being achieved. And I think it's right that we focus on cities because that's where most people live now, and that's only going to increase. This is the last set of graphs, I promise you. But the starting point for me is that cities need to have a strategy of so-called green growth. They need to be able to decouple economic growth from environmental resource consumption. And there are some examples of how that is being achieved. Portland here, one can see very strong growth in GDP, GVA, per capita over the last few decades, steady increasing employment, but at the same time, their greenhouse gas emissions per capita have actually declined, as has, in this just one indicator here, energy use in residential and commercial buildings per capita. And significantly, of course, this is a North American city, a nation which collectively is massively exceeding environmental boundaries. But the other example I've picked, and there are a number of other cities around the world that have a similar profile like this, is Belo Horizonte in Brazil, which on the face of it looks like it's going in the wrong direction because all of the lines are going up, very strong growth in GDP, but also an increase in their carbon footprint. And the orange line, the one that goes very steeply up from about 2005, is the amount of waste that's going to landfill. However, I would posit that actually Belo Horizonte, knowing a little bit more about it than what this graph can tell you, is actually another good example because this is a city that's third largest in Brazil, but extraordinary levels of poverty, which are now being massively alleviated by the economic growth that it's enjoying. And whilst its carbon footprint has risen massively, it's still only 1.6 tonnes per capita, which compare that with 10 tonnes average for the OECD countries. It's considerably less, and it's below the level at which the whole of the world's cities need to reach a steady state in order for us to avoid catastrophic climate change. And whilst their waste is going up, mainly on the back actually there of a massive increase in construction waste, they've put in place now really world-leading policies for how they're going to deal with that, moving away from landfill. But they've created hundreds and hundreds of jobs in the favelas, the poorest part of the city, in collecting that waste, so that now they have a 90% collection rate, up from about 40 or 50% only a decade ago. So both of these are examples, as long as Belo Horizonte now starts to get the graphs going down on the right-hand side, they're both examples of how you can decouple growth from environmental consequences. So I think that green growth strategy will need to underpin what cities do. But how do you achieve that? Well, one of the big issues for cities going forward is they're really going to need to run on data. If your challenge, as it is in Western cities, is to cut your carbon footprint 60 or 80%, then you've got to know with great accuracy where your carbon emissions currently are and be able to judge very accurately the impact of the policies that you make to alleviate that, so that you can consistently be putting your resources and using them in the most effective way. Now, there are many cities that are trying to deliver a so-called smart city strategy. I've picked San Francisco here because I think they're one of the first to set up a smart city approach in the truly comprehensive way, which is not just that they have some very good individual smart city policies, and there are many of those around the world. You know, my favourites are the small things like Singapore has done, where it's used its smart transport card not just as a way of using the mass transit system, but so that its pensioners can use it on the traffic lights throughout the city and swipe it so that they get a few extra seconds to cross the road, which is a really neat way of serving a community. But that isn't a smart city strategy. That's one good smart city policy. What San Francisco has done is to recognise that information communication technology needs to be treated in the same strategic way as the mainstays of city government policy. So they have a housing policy, a development strategy, an economic strategy, a transport strategy. They also now have an ICT strategy for the city, and they have an information communication technology director whose job is not just to look at the systems of the city, but to look at the infrastructure, the ICT infrastructure of the whole of the city. And the second thing they've done, which the former Mayor Gavin Newsom has been a real enthusiast around, and indeed has just written a book called Citizenville about, is empowering citizens through the use of the smart city, so making available the vast wealth of data that the city government has to let the private sector and individuals make their city a better place. And the image here is one of those examples. It's for a scheme called SF Park, where they've put sensors in all of the parking spaces in the downtown area of the city. They made that sensor data about when the spaces are being used or are empty freely available to the market, which has created a plethora of smartphone apps that allow drivers to find out how they can, where the nearest available free parking space is. That's important because when the city government had done a survey of their very congested central business district, they found that about 30% of the traffic had already arrived at its destination but was still circulating because it couldn't find somewhere to park, or the drivers couldn't find somewhere to park. But actually, even in the peak, there were more spaces than people who wanted to park. It's just people didn't know where they were quickly enough. This system, in the first trials, has reduced congestion by about 10% at a very, very low cost. So a green growth strategy, a smart city approach, but taking that smart city approach a stage further and thinking how to engage citizens. And indeed, if one looks at what the mayor in San Francisco thinks smart city is going to achieve, and I'll quote from his book, Citizenville. He says, "Citizenville is the story of how ordinary citizens can use new digital tools to dissolve political gridlock and transform American democracy," which is a very great aspiration for using a bit of technological kit. But his view is that the more that they can democratise city services through allowing citizens to engage and tell the government how they want things done and be part of delivering that, the better their services will be. And I think a good example, moving away from San Francisco, but from Helsinki, although this is currently in design stage, is this for a new development in Helsinki, where all of the apartments will be fully sort of smart enabled, smart meters, sensors across all of the transport systems, so there'll be lots of accurate data about how people are consuming energy and other services. But that will then be translated back into what they're calling a community wall, where the citizens will be able to go put their handprint on a space that is visible to everybody within the community, and get a shadow reflecting the size of their personal carbon footprint based on the data that is provided, so that they can compare with it with their neighbours, knowing that actually most people want to be like their neighbours. So using that fact that people actually often don't want to be different, but to encourage people to all improve their own carbon output. But I think it's impossible to talk about a sustainable future city without talking about transport. Because most of the cities in the world that are judged to be the most livable, the nicest places to live, and also the most environmentally and economically efficient are ones that have very sustainable transport systems. And I've deliberately started with an image of the bicycle, not mass transit, although I'll get to that, because I think that we're really going to see a return of the old-fashioned bicycle in the most successful cities of the world moving forward. And it's very interesting in a piece of work that Arup did for the C40 group of cities, 40 of the largest cities in the world, measuring the actions that the mayors in those cities had taken over the last 6 or 7 years in order to reduce carbon emissions. In the transport sector, the area that had seen the biggest growth in that period was investment in cycling. And this is in the biggest, most congested cities in the world, not the smaller ones like the Copenhagen. And indeed, the image on the screen here is from Mexico City. For anyone who's ever been there, one of the most traffic congested cities in the world, where the mayor is now investing very heavily in a bike hire scheme based on the Paris and the Lyon and the London examples, which is starting to get his citizens cycling for the first time. And there's a very good reason from that. If one does take it from the city most synonymous with cycling, from Copenhagen, where 35% of trips to work are by bike, and the city is aiming to get that up to 50%. But as we just heard at a meeting that Sir Howard and I were at just before this, from the Director of Development in Copenhagen, their motivation for pushing that cycling policy is largely economic.